Hi, I'm Steve Clements, and I have a question. If the Palestinian Authority has largely been a spectator during the Israeli war on Gaza, what will its future be after the war? Let's get to the bottom line. U.S. President Joe Biden wants to see a revitalized Palestinian Authority to take charge in Gaza once the war is over. The only catch is that Israel has killed and injured tens of thousands of Palestinians there in the past few weeks and basically flattened the entire Gaza Strip, making normal civilian life impossible. The other catch is that the Palestinian Authority, which co-manages civilian life with the Israeli military in the West Bank, is just not popular there either. And wait, there may be two more problems. One, no one's asking the Palestinians what they want. And two, the Israeli government has already said it doesn't like Joe Biden's ideas. So where does that leave America's plans? And is the Palestinian Authority stuck in a catch-22 situation where its efforts are undermined before they even begin? Today, we're talking with the former Prime Minister and Finance Minister of the Palestinian Authority, Salam Fayyad, who is now a visiting scholar at Princeton University. Salam, thank you so much for joining us. And obviously, this is a grim subject. It's tough to discuss while a war is underway, to be talking about what happens the day after. But you initiated that discussion with an important article in Foreign Affairs where you said there are things that need to be done, and you look at the Palestinian Authority and the PLO. Can you share with our audience what you think the building blocks are of a sensible future on the Palestinian side?
Well, thank you very much for having you on your program. I decided to actually go out with this article against the backdrop of beginning to hear some background conversations and noise about so-called day after, when the war was really in full swing, exacting very high toll in terms of unprecedented, indeed, loss of human life, destruction and all. But what struck me the most was some thinking that the day after was going to be characterized by a system in which Hamas had no existence, which was consistent, I guess, with the objective that the government of Israel set out for itself when it actually launched this war after October 7. To me, actually, that was a non-starter. And because everybody knew at the time, and Israel was called on it, that goal was impossible to attain. Hamas is an ideology, is a political movement with an ideology and ideas, and you cannot destroy a political movement. Subsequent to that, some other goals were mentioned, a little bit of the scaling back of that. Nevertheless, what we still have to this day ranges from the impossible to the highly unattainable. So to me, that conversation really actually meant that tens of thousands of Palestinian lives would perish before we got to that day, if ever. And that was not really going to happen, for certain. And so I decided, against the backdrop of that, to really put forward a Palestinian vision, just like my own ideas about what could and should happen. Gaza, after all, is an integral part of the territory Israel occupied in 1967, originally covered by the purview of the Palestinian Authority. Now, consistent with that motive that I have just underlined, I decided to really start that conversation by pointing to what should not be considered. First, I said, no arrangement that contemplates subjugating the Palestinians, imposing an arrangement of them after subjugating them should be considered. That should be really out of consideration altogether. And by that, I was referring to background noise about some transitional arrangement in Gaza involving some people from there dealing with the international community and all, again, assuming that Hamas is outside the scene completely. But what I had in mind at the time was the thinking that the PA would not want to really be seen as coming into Gaza on the back of an Israeli tank, as is often said. But even if it were willing to do it, I said it is not in a position to do it. And by that, I really meant the political weakness the PA was in. And that really actually was a segue into a conversation as to what needed to happen in order to provide the political enablement to the Palestinian Authority to be able to assume that massive responsibility. That's the background, and that's how I really got into this. And to really get into it, basically, I said, what needs to happen is, first of all, to really deal with the key reason as to why it is that the Palestinian Authority found itself after 3 decades of peace processing in such a terrible shape, politically speaking, so weak, so feeble, with not much standing with the public, with Palestinian public, whether in the territories over which it should have purview, or even amongst Palestinians throughout the world, as a matter of fact. And that key reason was the failure of the bet that the PLO took back in 1993 on the Oslo peace process, delivering on promise of statehood for the Palestinians. It has been many years now since most everybody has come to the conclusion that that promise was never going to really be fulfilled. Definitely not on the path where we Palestinians had found ourselves in the aftermath and in the course of that process. So that was the key contributor to that weakness, and much the same as had contributed to the standing of the PLO itself. What happened concomitantly with that was the PLO has lost much of its representational capacity. That's really the problem as I saw it. And I have seen it for many, many years. With the failure of Oslo, the PLO no longer really represented the consensus view amongst Palestinians in the way it did over the 5-year period between 1988 and 1993. That consensus, that virtually complete national consensus, fractured for sure upon the signing of the Oslo Accords. With the passage of time and the failure of Oslo to deliver on the promise of Palestinian statehood, the PA basically lost more and more of that representational capacity. What needed to happen was to expand the PLO in order to include in its ranks all Palestinian factions, including those that begged to differ with Oslo from the very beginning, especially Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and all other political forces. And by the way, Hamas and Islamic Jihad were not the only naysayers when it came to Oslo. There are some factions within the PLO itself that actually back to differ from the beginning. Nevertheless, over time, the base of dissent away from Oslo expanded progressively. So what we're looking at today is a shell of what the PLO used to be. I'm not really saying this with joy, actually. I'm really saying it out of realization that we have to do everything we possibly can to preserve the hard-won gain of having a home for us all Palestinians, which at one point actually meant something to say the sole legitimate representative of Palestinian people. But how much of that really continues to stand to this day? There are some who reacted to what I said by saying, how can you even be saying all of these things? I said, I say it because I care. If this is to be what it says it is, the sole legitimate representative of Palestinian people, it has to be expanded to include all points of view. It has to be that tent, that national tent, that home for everybody, including Hamas and Jihad. That was the basic idea that I had in mind, which would actually, in my view, provide the political enablement to the Palestinian Authority, because the Palestinian Authority is essentially an extension of the PLO.
So it's a remarkable provocation, because what you're arguing is the Palestinian Authority, as is now, is broken, and there's no hope of reviving this broken authority in current form. And so to re-anchor legitimacy, bringing all of the parties back into the PLO, including the one that Israel's at war with, including the one where much of the West says can never be in the government. You're arguing that in that patchwork of perspectives, Hamas has to be in there. Am I getting that right?
You're getting it absolutely right. And that's been my view for many years now. It's obvious. The PLO has lost much of its representational power. I mean, look at basically polls, what people say about what it is that they expect and how they really feel about that so-called peace process. Vast majority of Palestinians, for long have, left that station. And so our representational body, home, if you will, for it to actually represent us all points of view and all of that sort of thing, definitely has to be expanded to reflect all those points of views and not to really continue to be what it was when in fact it entered into Oslo agreements back in 1993. It's obvious. I mean, that is something that really needs to happen. Now, why is that a source of enablement? And let me be very clear. What I really had in mind when I said the PA as it exists today is unable to assume that responsibility, even if it were willing to do it, I had in mind the political weakness, the legitimacy, the acceptability, if you will. I did not have in mind, technical capacity, administrative capacity, which might be actually gleaned from statements made by American officials, U.S. officials, and others. Now, using terms like revitalized PA. Surely there is a lot of revitalization that's required. Anyone would tell you that this, in part, the weak standing of the PLO reflects a case of chronic misrule. So there's no question that that has to be fixed. The Palestinian Authority's capacity to govern must be enhanced and strengthened, and it must govern in full accord with the precepts of good governance. That's obvious, but that's not what I had in mind. The priority now is for the focus must be squarely on political enablement, because how else is a Palestinian Authority government, which in my construction needs to be consented to by the expanded PLO, which includes all factions and political forces, how in God's name is that government going to show up, the quote unquote, in the day after, which of course when it comes, it will not have come a day too soon for the tens of thousands of people who have been killed or injured, or the vast majority who have been displaced, not to mention the massive destruction that Israel has rained on Gaza Strip since October 7th. So how, in God's name, is a government like that going to show up the day after, begin to assume that responsibility, unless it is a product of a national consensus? That's to be absolutely essential, because minus that, it just simply would not have the legitimacy.
I want to ask you about Jake Sullivan, the president's national security advisor, President Biden's national security advisor, meeting with Mahmoud Abbas, trying to indicate that the United States is hoping the Palestinian Authority can clean up its act, can deal with corruption, can bring in young leaders. What I'm hearing from you is that is a false choice. Am I hearing that right?
That's not really the focus of my proposal. The focus of my proposal is political empowerment and enablement.
Right.
Imparting legitimacy and making the PLO what it is, what it should be, what it was, and it needs to be again, our sole legitimate representative. That's absolutely important. And that is really what would provide the legitimacy that's needed and the political enablement that's required. I'm not really saying the PA needs to fix it. I just have really actually mentioned that. But is that the reason why we really should be doing what we're doing? And is it really the case that it's just now that it has become that the PA has not really offered the best governance model in the world? That's not what the focus of conversation ought to be. The focus of conversation ought to be on answering the question of what it is it might take the Palestinian Authority, which would be a logical choice, the most logical choice to assume responsibility for managing the affairs of Palestinian people in Gaza Strip, exactly as it is responsible for managing the affairs of Palestinian people in the West Bank. Is it not incumbent on us Palestinians to say, here we are, we're ready to really actually assume that responsibility through a reconfigured and re-empowered and politically enabled Palestinian Authority to assume that responsibility? Then this whole conversation about who's going to be doing what on the day after would vanish, and Israel would no longer continue to hide behind such statements as we don't want to really turn this into this, that, or the other thing. That it will add to the instruments of pressure on the government of Israel to stop this war of aggression. That, by the way, has to be our overriding priority right now. All of these other conversations can wait. Revitalization, reinvigoration, all of that kind of stuff can wait. What is required now is political empowerment and enablement of Palestinian Authority to assume that responsibility today before tomorrow. And by the way, that is eminently doable and with great speed. The PLO has convened several meetings. As a matter of fact, of secretaries generals of various factions, the most recent of which took place in Al-Alamein in July of this year. And what happened then? What happened then was actually a statement read out by President Abbas that basically said the conferees had agreed to form a follow-up committee to follow up on that which they agreed to follow up on before. We don't need that. What we really need is for such meeting to take place, even if virtually, for them to say, No conditions on anybody. This is open for anyone, regardless of their political orientation or political ideology or program. Hamas and Jihad are welcome to join immediately. No one has conditions on anyone. It's open for everybody. What I'm really talking about is a forum that is actually the home of a multi-vision platform,
right,
where different visions can coexist at the same time. But that's what pluralism is about.
Salam, let me ask you a question about the composite of the PLO now. Hussein Sheikh, as I understand, the Secretary General of the PLO, is reticent about Hamas coming into that, has commented to Jake Sullivan that their violent tactics disqualify them. So I'm interested in the tectonics of how this might come about. Do you think the PLO will accept what you're saying it needs to do to reorient the legitimacy of the Palestinian people?
The PLO definitely has a choice to make. If the PLO chooses to continue to basically say, unless to the factions, including Hamas, unless you agree with our platform, you cannot join. Well, then it's going to really have to wait a very long period of time before these factions would decide to join. We asked the question, and that's what really people are wondering about. Is that really a logical expectation? Is it a logical expectation for membership in the PLO for various parties and factions, Palestinian on the Palestinian side, to agree to all that the PLO had signed to back in 1993, when 3 decades later everybody knows that process was not going to really take us anywhere. It's not any longer. It cannot. It's impossible. So, whereas there may have been some logic to that back in the 90s, unless you subscribe to this vision that really brought us here, that produced the PA, where is that logic of continuing to expect that to be a demand or expectation of the Palestinians? When in fact, the conceptual equivalent of that was never expected of any government in Israel. How logical is it for the PLO to continue to insist on that expectation of Hamas, Jihad, and others, maybe even the PFLP? How logical is it for it to continue to insist on that as a ticket for membership, when in Israel there is a government, and it's not really only Smotrich and Ben Gvir and all of that. Netanyahu himself, for many years, yesterday he was bragging about being the guy who really actually destroyed Oslo. Netanyahu himself repeatedly, for anyone who wanted to listen, repeatedly said, there's not going to be any sovereignty in the territory, on the territory between River Jordan and Mediterranean, but for Israel. He many times said that. Where is the Palestinian state in this? So when that expectation is placed on Hamas and others who would want to join, but for the platform of the PLO, this would make it totally illogical, if not really outright irresponsible. So the PLO has a choice to make here, and it's obvious which way it should go. Now, that position is much better presented to the world by a united Palestinian polity. It's not good enough for that to be presented by the PLO, because the PLO right now doesn't present it this way.
Right.
And it's not good for Hamas alone to present it this way, or Jihad, or those who oppose Oslo to play. It is best for us united to present the world with this vision. I am absolutely convinced. If united, the world would deal with us. That's my point.
What I'm hearing from you, Salam, is fascinating, because you're not asking permission from Israel or the U.S. You're saying this is what Palestinians and the PLO can do to restore the legitimacy of a movement across the public. And if Israel wants to play, great. If Israel doesn't want to play, you're going to continue to proceed. So I am interested in a couple of things. One is, how do you think Israel will respond to a PLO with a restored legitimacy? What do you think the United States, which you identify as one of the most powerful actors in this, should be doing with regard to a restored PLO that basically expels the Palestinian Authority, uses it if it can, discards it if it's irrelevant?
See, it's been always my approach to think about what it is that is in our best interest as Palestinians. To begin the conversation by what suits Israel is definitely the wrong foot to enter this room in. Or what the world would find acceptable, not acceptable. We know that that's really not the right way to go. There is no national movement that really seeks liberation, as ours, has been and continues to do. That really actually starts conversation on the basis of what its enemy desires to see. That just really is the wrong point of entry. So to me, there is no other solution to the current impasse, to the current challenge that we face, the fracture in our body politic. We need to repair that as soon as possible. And that actually, the stoppage of the war, I see, is actually contingent on our capacity to accomplish that objective. The sooner we put ourselves in a position to go through and say, here we are, united in this position. It is my bet, and this is not really something that I constructed in the abstract, based on many, many conversations I've had over the years now, with many who would not really want to hear the word Hamas, jihad, resistance, or any of that, who actually in recent years have been telling me, you've been telling us these stories for a long period of time, are we getting in your way? Meaning, it really is up to us. And honestly, I believe, if we are united, look, I mean, Israel was not very fond, let's just remember, Israel itself was not very fond of dealing with the PLO. And anybody who knows anything about our history knows that. Israel did everything humanly possible to avoid dealing with the PLO and try to look for all kinds of formulas up until it really decided there is no other way but to really actually try to reach accommodation with the PLO. And that's what it decided to really do this. When they decided to really enter into this transactional arrangement with the PLO, they decided because they really felt that they had no choice. What we really need to do is to answer the simple question. How is it that we can go about uniting our politics in a way that makes it possible to go to world and say, this is who we are, this is what we really want to accomplish, and this is how we really want to go about it. My bet is that the world would deal with the united Palestinian polity. If we continue to project ourselves as a component here, another there, I'm afraid that Israel, as well as others, will be exploiting the differences and meddling in our own internal affairs, when our own internal affairs are really our own business. There is no other way. There is no logic to continue to exclude, these other factions, including Hamas and Jihad. And there is no logic for Hamas or Jihad to continue to not really actually forcefully seek to join the PLO tomorrow on no conditions. No one has any conditions on anyone. And this has even, I have not really said a thing except in passing, but all we have to do is just look at where Israel is. It has been my view that the center of gravity of Israeli body politic was never accepting of the idea of a fully sovereign Palestinian state on the territory Israel occupied in 1967, especially in the West Bank.
Well, we'll have to leave it there. Fascinating conversation. Former Palestinian Prime Minister Salam Fayyad, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Steve, very much for having me. Appreciate it.
So what's the bottom line? Listen, more than 90 Palestinian journalists, the only journalists on the ground in Gaza for the most part, have been killed by Israeli forces in the past 73 days. That means more than one journalist killed on average per day. One of the latest of these is Al Jazeera cameraman Samer Abu Daqqa, who, along with Gaza chief correspondent Wael Dahdouh, was fired on by an Israeli drone at an elementary school that had already been destroyed earlier in the day. They were trying to bring us the story of what's happening. Samer bled for hours, and medics who tried to reach him were not allowed to get close. Wael was injured but survived. If you'll remember, most of his family was killed by Israeli forces earlier in the war. If media who wear bright signs indicating they are media are targeted, all are clearly targeted. And this is what the world is watching right now. Thankfully, the world has fearless people who are literally risking it all to tell us what's happening. And that's the bottom line.